It would be like if Robert Mueller, like during the Mueller inquiry, right, in the States. So imagine like the conservatives were ashamed of what he found, and then to clarify their image, they appointed him as like their presidential candidate. So Yoon himself was this kind of longstanding prosecutor, seen as unbeholden to no one. He had prosecuted the Chables, the two former presidents. So he was actually seen as this kind of weird bastion of fairness. So although he adopted, he uses this kind of ideology of liberal democracy or anti-communism, he wasn't necessarily seen as your like traditional like wingnut conservative.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustabia, on fait le bunga, bunga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex O'Healy in São Paulo, Brazil. We are also George Hoare in London. Hi, George.
Yes, we are. Hi, Alex.
And today we're also Jamie Doucette in Hawaii, which I think we've got this fantastic global triangulation because we're also going to be talking about Korea. Jamie is a reader at the University of Manchester. He studies contemporary political economy and is an expert in Korea's development, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, Jamie.
Hi there. Nice to be here.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you. This is the second episode we do on South Korea in the space of some 12 months, and that 6 months or something, because we did an episode last year specifically on Korea's fertility freefall and somewhat connected gender strife. So kind of a lot of the kind of cultural issues which are fascinating about Korea. I find South Korea really interesting without knowing a huge deal about it. So I hope Jamie is able to fill in a huge number of blanks for me. I think that South Korea is like this really good capitalist propaganda tool if you were going to devise such a thing, because you have, the reality of the failure of genuine catch-up development in many parts of the world, and the Republic of Korea, which, has an HDI of like, wealthy Western European countries, I think higher than the US. I think this is something that the development economist Ha-Joon Chang likes to point out, that at Ghana's independence in 1957, both Ghana and South Korea had similar levels of GDP per capita. Only 30 years later, South Korea, as it democratized, its GDP per capita was 10 times that of Ghana. So, Korean capitalism did well. It's also a liberal democracy with a kind of, it seems like a quite westernized culture, and at any rate punches well above its weight in the kind of global culture industry game. And it faces down this, horrible communist dystopia to its north. It's also richer and freer than the power to its west in China. So it seems like this, fantastic story. If anybody wanted to defend capitalism, particularly Western capitalism, Korea would be the thing you'd point to. That isn't obviously our interest here, and we're far more interested in the crises of our times. So this is going to be an episode about modernity and development and the crises of it, and also about chaotic politics, which is where we're going to start, because I think people will have heard, I think this was a kind of fairly rare foray for South Korea into global headlines at the end of last year, as the country's president, Yoon Suk Yeol, declared martial law, effectively mounting a coup. And there's so many ins and outs to this political drama that I thought we could start there. So Jamie, if you could fill us in, what happened, what led up to this coup attempt, and what has ensued since?
Yeah, yeah, great introduction. There's a lot of things to comment on there, and then there's the current situation, which is still ongoing. In December, Yoon declares martial law. A lot of the soldiers don't act on it. People resist. I don't want to go through the whole play-by-play, but the situation since then has been, I guess, quite interesting and concerning. Yoon was finally arrested, about a week ago. It's created a bit of a constitutional crisis because he doesn't want to recognize the legitimacy of the organization, the Committee for Investigating the Crimes of the High Officials, or the CIO, that's investigating him There's an interesting backstory to that. His party have been defending him, trying to undermine the courts, block his arrest. There's the emergence of a kind of quasi neo-fascist formations kind of coming out of the woodwork too, who invaded the court over the weekend. So it's kind of a real concerning moment of crisis.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, and what's crazy about it is that this thing, I mean, for people who don't follow Korea very closely, it seemed to kind of come out of the blue. Lots of talk about
Came out
coups
of the blue
and the
for
poss-
me.
Yeah, right. And right. So I mean, how could this emerge, right? Because you have talk about, is Trump going to do a coup, which I thought was never very credible. Here in Brazil, there were much more credible threats of a coup, even if the attempt was far from successful. Korea, like what's going on there? He just declared martial law. So was this just a very individualistic sort of move, or
They
did
arrived
it?
with helicopters at the National Assembly and some armored vehicles. So
Right. But I mean, but they didn't.
6,000 troops mobilized, but some of them just went and ate instant noodles and knew that this was highly illegal. Some people saw it coming. I thought it would have been more likely during the Candlelight Revolution in 2016, 2017 with the impeachment of Park Chung-hee, who is the former dictator's daughter, who brought back all these figures from the dictatorship era into her cabinet. They were blacklisting. There were plans that were drawn up for martial law at that point, but they were not acted upon. But it would be much more likely then. Yeah, not a lot. Some people did see it coming. A Democratic lawmaker who I guess has his sources sort of noticed that Yoon was appointing a lot of his buddies from high school, his private high school in Western Seoul, to high up positions in the military. They also had connections to the Korean Military Academy, which has been a kind of source of martial law or dictatorial forces in the past. But yeah, not a lot did. What was interesting after the Candlelight Revolution, Yoon, who was the Minister of Justice for the Democratic Party at that point, really kind of consolidated the power around his faction of prosecutors. So one would have thought that would have been the source that this comes through, but instead the kind of main plotters are like these high school buddies, his weird fortune teller friends, and some others. So there's weird elements of surprise here, as well as some predictable elements in the sense of the longstanding tradition of a kind of virulent anti-communism that he and other conservatives espouse. Yeah, that's been around for so long. Who knew that it would have culminate in like early December?
Right. I mean, that's the surprising thing because, I mean, to me, it sounds like this guy is a kind of somewhat unreconstructed conservative type who's nostalgic for military dictatorship. There's some of the terms that you use we're going to come on to hopefully discuss in terms of like candlelight revolution, which is a kind of sort of new thing to me in terms of understanding its breadth, I guess. But we're going to come to that in a second. What kind of character is this Yoon then, if you can flesh out?
It would be like if Robert Mueller, like during the Mueller inquiry, right, in the States. So imagine like the conservatives were ashamed of, in the States where the Republicans were ashamed of what he found. And then to clarify their image, they appointed him as like their presidential candidate. So Yoon himself was this kind of longstanding prosecutor, seen as unbeholden to no one. He had prosecuted the Chables, the two former presidents. So he was actually seen as this kind of weird bastion of fairness. So although he adopted, he uses this kind of ideology of liberal democracy or anti-communism, he wasn't necessarily seen as your like traditional like wingnut conservative.
Right.
So that,
right, yeah.
So I mean, he was the Democratic Party's Minister of Justice, although he resigned in protest when the Democratic Party started to correct for the awful power of the prosecution, which in Korea, right, has more power, has so much power over arrest and indictment.
So who would be his kind of like typical supporter? Could you paint us a bit of a maybe like a sociological picture? Who's like, yeah, who does he represent, or who is particularly I don't know, drawn to this? You said a kind of Mueller type character, because you can imagine in an American context who might be the supporter there, but in South Korean society, does it work the same way?
Yeah, I mean the conservative. I was going to say the Conservative Party, Korean parties change their official names twice every cycle.
Yeah.
But their traditional power is in the southeast, right? The kind of big industrial area. So that's where the support for the party comes. I think people within the party saw it as a way to resuscitate their image. There was kind of a sidelining, I think, of other factions in the party. I don't know if necessarily they'd be his natural choice now, but they're still rallying around him in the way that many Republicans rallied around Trump. I think maybe the swing vote was what sometimes the kind of Gangnam upper classes, some of them also voted for him, but mostly the power is in the southeast. If
Cool.
that helps.
That
Yeah. So
so
it's interesting because traditionally there's a lot of people in that party who support the kind of Park Chung-hee myth. And I think for some, he was seen as an alternative to that, but he got along quite well with those folks quite quickly.
Okay, and this is the kind of myth of the authoritarian development, which we're going to come on to. And jump in if I'm mischaracterizing things already. But one last thing on this bizarre coup attempt, which seems like something out of the blue. It seemed to me like, in contrast to Cold War dictatorships, Cold War military dictatorships, in which it was an attempt really to militarize society, and this was definitely the case in South Korea, from my understanding. This was just an attempt to kind of exert political force. So it was like a purely political phenomenon, as opposed to being a kind of society-wide thing. It was just like, I'm going to use force, or the threat of force, to get my way in parliament. But it didn't seem to be like leading to kind of tanks across the country, right? It didn't seem to be like, it was like clamping down on civil society. It was just a political phenomenon.
There's a kind of untimely element to it, because at this moment the Democratic Party is at maybe not its least progressive. It's a pretty centrist party right now, right? So there's not necessarily a strong radical opposition to Yoon. So he's doing this coup against like a centrist party, and including people in his own party, his own kind of prosecutor faction, some of which had broken with him, right? So he was trying to get Han Dong-hoon, his protege, arrested. There's different theories. Is he trying to do this in the sense of, one of the theories is he's trying to fabricate some confrontation with the North to justify martial law and demonstrate his importance in a changing world where maybe Trump isn't so interested in supporting the South anymore because of his overtures to Kim Jong-un in the past. That's like a speculative theory that people had. Part of it is like this kind of last-ditch attempt to like protect his wife from investigation, and maybe himself. He's frustrated by the ability of the Democratic Party, who have the majority in parliament, to overturn many of his plans. But, when the Republicans do, they don't allow the budget to get passed or the debt ceiling to be exceeded. It's not like Biden's going to like would have pulled a coup, but this is part
Right.
of what Apple did in Korea. So I don't know if that gets at some of the things you're interested in.
Well, I mean, yeah, I guess in some ways it just complicates the puzzle somewhat further. I have loads of questions about this cycle of revenge politics and lawfare in Korea, what the left-right spectrum actually looks like today. But I think there's so many historical references, we might as well jump straight to the history and come back to the contemporary politics at the end of this.
It's a good way to do it. It's like a drama which shows you the kind of dramatic scene of now, and then goes back kind of 50 years previously, and then comes back to the crisis bit. It's a good storytelling technique.
It's all crisis, George. It's all crisis.
Well,
so Korea has this history of, as I said, could be a poster boy for Western capitalism, because, this is capitalism and then eventually liberal democracy being successful in the East. So it has this incredibly fast late development under authoritarian conditions. You've already made reference to the Park Chung-hee myth. So what is the Park Chung-hee reality? He takes power in 1962. And is assassinated in 1979. So what happens during this period? Because Korea begins developing very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the myth of Park Chung-hee is similar to like the academic myth, I would say, of the developmental state, that there's this kind of wise, omniscient brain that kind of plans the economy. Now, it doesn't mean that the government didn't try to pursue development as a means of securing its legitimacy, but that it's a much more conflictual and complicated things are going on. But the myth would be that, he was this kind of wise, beneficial leader who kind of, just developed for all, when really it's a much more complex story. academically too, I think developmental state theory often is a kind of soft version of this, right? They have this idea of this kind of wise meritocratic bureaucracy or kind of like governing the market. But this kind of view also ignores a lot of the conflict going on, the kind of wider geopolitical situation. In your introduction, you kind of got on one of my pet peeves, which is Ha-Joon Chang's like, oh, Korea was like Ghana and now we're like this, which I feel like is always a very unfair, subtly discriminatory comparison, right? Korea had just come out of a horrific war, but also it's part of the Pax Americana. It also has different dynamics of development going on during the Japanese period. It's part of the Japanese colonialism. So it's that's also kind of a complicated comparison to make. Sorry.
No, absolutely. I was, merely portraying what the kind of propagandistic take on South Korea is, if you wish to make one, which again isn't my interest. My interest is understanding here why Korea was able to develop in the way it did.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. Just to tack something onto this, just to, I guess, spell out a bit more about the developmental state for listeners who might not be familiar with this term, this kind of, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but the basic idea is that this is a kind of the state-led macroeconomic planning, particularly in East Asia in the kind of second half of the 20th century, that you have this kind of, as you were saying, these state bureaucrats who are kind of very rational, very very smart guys, very good at their job. And through this kind of use of, I guess, kind of bureaucratic rationality, you see good economic decisions being made and you see GDP just compounding up year on year on year and the growth really kind of going exponentially. That, I think, is is that the kind of the propagandistic or the kind of simple kind of developmental state of how many economies, not just South Korea, but particularly perhaps South Korea, have developed?
That's the script. It kind of goes back to what you said earlier about Korea being the poster child for Western capitalism. I'm not exactly sure what Western capitalism is, but for a certain type of capitalist development. And I think that the irony there is that it's claimed by like both camps, right? Free marketers like Ann Kruger and others were often like, oh, this is a good example of, liberalization, like that the free market works. And whatever industrial policy there was, that just complicated the picture and, could have been bad. And then others are like, Korea is the example that the free market doesn't work and that planning does, right? And often what you see is a kind of parsimony between different camps. It has to be kind of either or, right? If the market isn't present, then it can't work, or if the kind of state isn't present. But I find that those are both like very abstract and kind of belie what actually happened. So I think you're right about your kind of stereotypical depiction of the developmental state, this idea of a wise kind of bureaucracy. But once again, that's kind of an ideal type. And when you kind of go peel beneath the surface of what that theory, how it's constructed and what it says, there's a lot of limits, right? So the idea was that the state was kind of coherent. They identified, they argued that the state needed to be autonomous from society, right? So it couldn't really be, it ignored questions like hegemony or legitimacy. Mostly they identified the state with a kind of economic bureaucracy. But this really neglects all these different sorts of relations going on within the state between even a very conservative civil society at the moment, but within kind of US foreign policy and geopolitics, right? It doesn't mean that there wasn't planning. There was, but it was much more, I think, haphazard and complicated. I think the strongest argument that can be made for developmental state theory was in the control of finance. I think that's where the theory is most plausible. There were, the use of policy loans, discounted credit to the Chables based on performance standards, like expanding into foreign markets, increasing local components, all that kind of stuff. That's a bit more plausible. But we ignore the kind of broader politics, I think, at its peril.
And if you could maybe explain to us, give us some examples of the Chables, explain to us what they are, and say how they played a major role in Korean development.
Yeah, the Chables comes from the Japanese word for like wealth clan. These large kind of family-led firms that are highly diversified. They benefit from all those industrial policy loans and collusion with the government to become these kind of big corporations. Even Park Chung-hee was kind of concerned about their power and actually tried to disperse their ownership, but he didn't try really hard, or the Chaebol were able to kind of evade these sort of sanctions by through cross shareholding. So even to this day, those Chaebol families don't directly own a lot of their firms. Like I think Samsung owns like 1.5% of its whole group, but it has more than 50% of control through these cross shareholding arrangements. And that creates its own kind of problem in Korean politics. So it's very hard to pass down control over that firm legally without an immense tax bill. So Chaebol are often do kind of weird things like undervalue one firm to pass the shares on to a kid and others. So this is a kind of unstable aspect of Korean corporate governance. Japan had something similar, but the Americans kind of changed it into a more group model after World War II with a kind of financial institution at the heart to avoid this kind of situation.
So, I mean, you already made reference to the fact that the Korean situation was kind of unique, I think, in terms of its ability to develop, which is again why the propaganda story doesn't work very well. Because you can't just say to everybody like, "Hey, why can't you be a Korea?" Because there was an important element there, which was the Americans that you just mentioned. So, what role did the U.S. play in prompting and providing an environment for Korea to develop so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly an expert on the post-1997 changes to the Korean economy, but of course you need to know what's gone on before. The U.S. provided a lot of aid to Korea. One could argue that the Chaebol learned a lot of their kind of infrastructure skills in fulfilling overseas procurement contracts for the U.S. military during the Vietnam War, like their port dredging, highway building expertise. A lot of that comes from their participation in that. There's a lot of networking with American infrastructure firms as well. So there's a kind of broader story there, and that's where sometimes this developmental state line doesn't always work, because in some cases the Chaebol were themselves relatively autonomous from the state and could make a lot of decisions over their economic plans. They weren't subordinate. They're sort of one of many partners in this kind of trans-Pacific class formation. Jim Glassman, who was my PhD supervisor many years ago, has written a good book, like the HM series called Drums of War and Drums of Development, where he tries to explore what he calls the trans-Pacific ruling class. It might be something your viewers are interested in.
Yeah, indeed, and listeners, for those who aren't with us visually. So, one last question on. I don't want to dwell too much on this kind of mid-Cold War period. I want to move towards the kind of democratization at the end of the 80s in just a second. But one last question. Korea's development was so tightly interlinked with its military, what its felt military imperatives were defense against the North. And I want to understand maybe a little bit better what drove, I mean, whether these felt military imperatives drove development, if that was the kind of prompt that this development of this mass military industrial complex, which the Chables were also providing kind of and developing arms, as far as I understand as well, or had always had a military application, whether that was the kind of main driver of it, with basically like, did the Cold War make Korea develop, or was there something else?
That's a good question. Sometimes I think some more conservatives often say like Korea felt this existential threat, but I don't. I think that kind of approach like ignores the politics of the friend enemy distinction and what that kind of does to both regiment your own society. Like I don't know exactly what the threat from North Korea might have been, but the exaggeration of that threat was certainly used to kind of militarize and mobilize society. That is certainly something that is true. Yeah, sorry. What's the second part of your question?
Well, whether this drive for kind of, I think, as far as I understand it, the drive for self-reliance and self-defense was kind of a major part in driving forward development, or if there was some kind of other internal dynamic which you hold to account for
yeah,
this.
I guess there's like the trauma of Japanese colonialism. There is like, this kind of sense of wanting to have a strong economy to, defend oneself from vulnerability. I think more broadly, there is this attempt to like at legitimation. Now, developmental state theorists reject the idea of legitimation, right? But I think that's sort of important. There's an attempt to legitimize power through development. I think the dictatorship is extremely coercive, and it's not good to celebrate it. A lot of Korean intellectuals try to talk about both sides. So you could look at someone like the progressive economist Lee Byung-chun. He came up with this theory of the developmentalist dictatorship, right? So trying to understand how the dictatorial power kind of legitimize itself through development, both in terms of what he calls the shadows and the light, right? So he acknowledges the benefits of planning as opposed to a kind of free market approach, but he's also extremely critical of all the kind of regimentation, oppression, and exploitation. Similar to a lot of Marxist theory, they're like, the state is no neutral arbiter here between like labor and capital. It's doing all its interventions in a way that creates capitalist social relations, right? Exploitable wage labor, cheap social reproduction in the sense of like the lack of welfare, etc. So we have to look at it in this kind of way.
All right. So, there's this vast period of development, and South Korea then democratizes at the end of the 1980s as part of a global wave, really kind of to close off the short 20th century and inaugurate the end of history. What were the internal drivers to democratization then? Who, was this an elite-led thing, or was this more from the bottom that led, pressures from below that drove a democratization?
Yeah, I mean, there's always like strong social movements or processes of mobilization going on in Korea throughout the period of industrialization. And the 1970s, I think, are really important when it comes to like working class mobilization in sweatshops and the textile industry. A lot of this is women-led mobilization. Students, intellectuals, always a part of this kind of movement. After the Gwangju massacre in 1980, there's this kind of mobilization accelerates. The student movement, the Minjung movement, or the people's movement, really kind of heats up, kind of building on the kind of green shoots of the 1970s social movements, and it all kind of cascades into the 1987 June Democratic Uprising and the Great Workers' Struggle. Most people know the June Democratic Uprising, but immediately after that, conflict spreads across industrial workplaces. And this is kind of the rise of the more male heavy industrial workers movement, or is often depicted in ways that forgets its kind of female-led precursors. And that also kind of almost immediately changes industrial relations as unions are reclaimed or new independent unions are established against the more conservative.
So yeah, I had a question about the post-developmental stakes. Obviously, this is the focus of your book. But could I just sort of, and correct me if I'm wrong, on like this kind of periodization of like South Korean history of like from what you've said, so the post-war period until the late 80s, very very quick development, and then the democratization from which started in or really accelerated in the late 80s through to the 97 crisis, and then a neoliberalization particularly from 97 to 2016. Is this a kind of too simplified a picture, or is this a kind of enough for listeners to kind of to sink their teeth into?
I guess generally you have post-war, you have Lee Syngman, who's kind of corrupt and cronyist, but there's some land reform going on. The more modernization theory of development type stuff, the rapid stuff happens after the Park Chung-hee coup in the early 60s. That kind of period between 60 to 80 is the really kind of high period of industrial policy. That stuff continues on into the early 90s in some form, but already in the 1980s, even before then, the more neoliberal American trained economists are kind of being installed kind of under Chun Doo-won, although there's always some of those types around. I think a lot of the neoliberalization that led to the 97 crisis kind of happens in the early 90s, especially the liberalization of borrowing on short-term borrowing on foreign exchange, because without industrial policy limiting how the Chables can borrow, a lot of them just went hog wild, like racking up debt, competing in the same product lines. And then when the Thai baht collapsed in 97 and all these loans came in, that's when things went.
Right.
And that's a period. It's a period. I don't know if it's like hardcore neoliberalism, but post-developmental state, it's kind of a period without maybe a solid model. There's elements of neoliberalism. There's still some planning. There's always planning anyways, but it's a bit more amorphous since then.
Right, and it's for what ends and by whom, which are obviously the big questions. Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage Magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.
De A ou pas se taire.